Everyone knows about the mass panic that led to the fall of EC Comics and their rivals in America during the 1950s. But Britain too had a hysterical campaign against horror comics and the influence of American publications that strangely parallels the later video nasty panic, and which led to legislation that was quickly forgotten, but which still sits on the statute books ready to be used against any publisher who goes too far. This is The Overlooked Hotel, and this is the story of Britain's first horror-based moral panic and the odd role that the Communist Party played in it. It began, as these things often do, with a touch of snobbery. George Pumphrey was a headmaster at a school in Sussex. Diana Sinnott was a teacher in a tough comprehensive on the Old Kent Road. Peter Morgan was a teacher in Chingford and this is significant, a member of the Communist Party. All three individually came across imported or reprinted American crime and horror comics at the end of the 1940s, and all three were appalled at what they saw. The comics were crudely printed, literally pulp publications, the British editions emerging on whatever paper was the cheapest, and slapped together with little care or attention by independent publishers. And they were far from what British people believed comics should be. The British, even today, still tend to see comics as juvenile entertainment. Back in 1949, the idea of comics aimed at adults was beyond comprehension. For these teachers, comics were suitable only for children, a crude and disposable form of entertainment that had no literary worth. Even the most wholesome of comics, the Beanos and the Dandies of this world, have long been viewed with some suspicion by a certain sort of patrician teacher, the kind who feels that kids should be poring over the classics as soon as they can read rather than enjoying the empty pleasures of the comic strip. But these comics, from famous EC classics like The Vault of Horror to less well-known fly-by-night titles, were hardly wholesome. Even today, the post-war, pre-code American horror and crime comics are startlingly lurid, gore-drenched, mean-spirited, cynical, and morally ambiguous. In 1949, to people already inclined to see comic books as essentially worthless and to have an instinctive belief that they, above everyone else, know what is good for society, well, these comics must have seemed beyond outrageous. In his essential study of the era, A Haunt of Fears, Martin Barker quotes Reverend Chad Varra, who would later found the Samaritans and help launch the Eagle comic as a direct, stiff, upper-lipped, wholesome English riposte to the crude American imports. In the time-honoured method of third-hand, evidence-free anecdotes that censorship campaigners love to engage in and are rarely questioned on, Varra talks of a Peggy Middleton, yet another teacher, who found an 11-year-old pupil reading a comic that featured a drug addict flogging a naked girl to death with a bicycle chain, and then found similar material in every desk of the class. Context or believability be damned, this was certainly shocking stuff. Middleton joined Pumphrey, Sinnott, Morgan and others in what was a quickly growing and suspiciously coordinated campaign against the dangers of these comics. Then, as now, the protection of children was the Trojan horse for censorship groups, but the reality of the campaign was to control what anyone could see, to socially engineer a society that the campaigners approved of, and to silence dissent and deviation. We see the same behaviour today over harmful online content. A similar campaign against comic books was underway in America, where Frederick Wortham's Seduction of the Innocent would lead the way in a moral panic about children being warped by lurid comic books, using similarly apocryphal tales and selective readings of comic book narratives that reduce them to their most basic elements. But while the overt concerns were the same, the underlying panics between Britain and America were very different. In the USA, the horror comics were frequently seen as being part of some communist plot to undermine American society. In Britain, it was the communists who were leading the charge against what they saw as corrupt and decadent American culture infiltrating British society. Pumphrey would become the figurehead of the Comics Campaign Council, a campaigning body with an official sounding name that, in the tradition of unofficial bodies that pretend to be legally sanctioned, made them sound much more important and informed than was actually the case, and they quickly set the agenda for the discussion of horror comics. The comics were painted as worthless, obscene, corrupting, and dangerous to the moral development of children. Then, as now, the anti-censorship campaigners were caught on the hop and unsure what to do. No one, not even the writers and artists who you might think would be instinctively against censorship, wanted to defend the comics. In one of the many parallels to the video nasty's hysteria 30 years later, liberals and intellectuals were unwilling to speak up against the censorial, either because they were afraid, who wants to defend the corruption of children after all, or because they too had a snobbish disregard for the material. Tales from the Crypt was no Lady Chatterley's lover after all, and what did it matter if such material was swept from the shelves? It wasn't as if the same laws could be used against serious works, was it? There was another, rather more hidden aspect to the campaign, as Barker's book revealed. Many of those involved in the campaign against horror comics were members of the Communist Party, and for them the threat of the comics was more the American part than the horror part. The horror and crime content was seen as just another example of American cultural decadence, with comics being just a part, along with American movies, music and literature, of the threat to traditional British culture. As Sam Aronovich, the British Communist Party's cultural spokesman, said, British culture was Shakespeare, Chaucer, Charles Dickens, Constable, Turner, Francis Bacon and Charles Darwin. A curiously nationalistic, privileged and traditionalist collection of establishment figures for radical communists, you might think. The cultural world of the Britain they wanted was one that absolutely did not include the decidedly low cultural pleasures of the comic book, especially ones that brought the distinctly American diseases of crime, gang warfare, loose morals and, significantly, anti-communism in the form of Russian and Chinese villains. As the campaign gathered momentum, so the communist connection was downplayed and eventually washed over completely. After all, if they wanted to get the conservative government of the day on board, then the campaign needed to be less political and more social. Still anti-American perhaps, but with an anti-Americanism that was more cultural. The British middle classes have long looked down their nose at American culture, especially the popular sort. It was, therefore, easy to de-emphasise the communist involvement in the campaign by appealing to British cultural snobbery and the belief, as we've seen with every moral panic since, that it's the lower orders with their baser tastes who need to be protected from themselves and guided towards the right sort of culture. The Comics Campaign Council proved to be a determined campaigning propaganda group and published their own Wortham-esque pamphlet, Comics and Your Children, in 1954. Psychologist Phyllis Packard convened a panel of carefully selected educators, magistrates and other middle-class citizens, including Pumphrey, to look into the issue and produce their own report called British Comics: An Appraisal. And as you might expect, both reports were light on facts but heavy on hysteria, and reached evidence-free conclusions about the dangers of American horror comics. As with the Video Nasties campaign, the press and the campaigners quickly picked up on cases that allegedly proved the dangers of horror comics. Alan Poole was a young thug who died in a shootout with the police and was allegedly found in a hideout full of crime comics. The hysteria surrounding the Gorbals vampire, when children in Glasgow became briefly obsessed with the idea that a vampire was on the loose and roamed the streets armed to the teeth trying to track the monster down, was blamed on the pernicious influence of horror comics. And the rise of teddy boys and other juvenile delinquents, rather gloriously described by the Daily Mail in 1954 as a collection of spivs, bohunks and yahoos, listlessly shifty-eyed, tailor-dummied youths and painted trollops, was again blamed on the influx of delinquent American culture, primarily comic books. Evidence for the claims of a connection was, of course, thin, but the stories were hyped relentlessly by the press and the campaigners. Before long, the Comics Campaign Council had recruited the National Union of Teachers to their cause, a helpful addition that gave them a more direct route to the government. In 1954, the NUT mounted an exhibition of the worst of the comics, much like Mary Whitehouse's infamous collection of the most violent scenes from video nasties shown without context to MPs and the media in an effort to shock them into legislative action. As with that cynical manipulation, the exhibition had the desired effect. The government announced a bill to deal with this foreign menace, and in 1955, after barely any public or parliamentary debate, the tersely worded and predictably ambiguous Children and Young Persons (open brackets, Harmful Publications) close brackets, Act came into force, which outlawed any book, magazine or other like work which is of a kind likely to fall into the hands of children or young persons and consists wholly or mainly of stories told in pictures with or without the addition of written matter, being stories portraying A, the commission of crimes, or B, acts of violence or cruelty, or C, incidents of a repulsive or horrible nature, in such a way that the work as a whole would tend to corrupt a child or young person into whose hands it might fall. As with many a British moral law, it seems at first glance to be, assuming that you agree with the outlawing of horror comics at all, reasoned and restrained, but of course the commission of crimes and acts of violence are remarkably loose ideas that can be applied to almost anything. A determined person might even consider a Dennis the Menace strip to fall foul of these rules. Such vague rulings could have serious consequences for those deemed to have broken them. A fine of £100, a significant amount in 1955, equivalent to $2,230 today, and or up to 4 months in prison awaited. Like many of British law, it was initially passed for a specific period, in this case 10 years, and then brought up for renewal in 1965. And like almost every such law, it was renewed without debate, despite the fact that there had been no successful prosecutions in the preceding decade, a fact that the Act's supporters would chalk up as evidence of its success rather than its pointlessness. The Act remains in force to this day, and if you think that that's simply because of oversight, think again. The fine was increased to £1,000 in 1982, though any cases will now be treated as summary offences, that is, heard by magistrates rather than a judge and jury. Given that you can still be sent to prison, I'm not sure that helps. Nevertheless, the Attorney General refused to support prosecutions in 46 cases between 1955 and 1982. This is despite the fact that the law, as worded and intended, was widely ignored. The Comics Code approved US horror comics from Marvel, DC and others were widely imported from the 1970s onwards, as were more visceral magazine format comics from companies like Skywald. In 1974, Marvel UK launched Dracula Lives, a weekly comic reprinting stories from Tomb of Dracula, Werewolf by Night and other US Marvel horror comics. This was either a direct provocation or more likely because no one at Marvel even knew the law was in force. In 1984, IPC published Scream, another weekly comic that was the horror equivalent of 2000 AD, which itself was probably in violation of the law. House of Hammer adopted Hammer horror movies into comics, as well as running other horror strips from 1976 to 1978. Other publishers also reprinted US horror comics from the 1970s onwards in magazine form, and did so without problems. In truth, the Children and Young Persons Harmful Publications Act was somewhat made redundant by the Obscene Publications Act of 1959, a much wider-ranging act that was used extensively and so became the go-to law for the authorities to use against the more extreme and explicit comics, such as Savoy's Lord Horror, Japanese manga and underground comics, while HM Customs would often seize publications that were being imported. But it is worth repeating, this law is still in force. There's a precedent of long forgotten laws being dredged up by angry campaigners who can't get satisfaction in any other way, and we should never disregard the possibility of some moralizing group pushing a case against an indie comic that they've been outraged by even now. This is a useless, pointless piece of legislation, but as long as it exists, it remains a theoretical stick that the powers that be can beat errant publishers with if they choose to. As always, I'm curious to know what you make of this story. Which titles do you think have been blatantly breaking the law for all these years? Or have you had experience of comic books being seized by customs or the police? If you like this sort of forgotten history, then feel free to give this video a like and share it with friends. And if you'd care to subscribe to the Overlook Hotel, we'd appreciate it greatly. It costs nothing and every bit of support helps grow the channel. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you again soon.